Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Darden, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us today here on Navy Sports Central. I'm your host, and this is the official podcast of the Navy Sports Nation, where we take a deeper dive into Navy sports. In this episode, we're going to dig into the Army-Navy rivalry from its very beginnings. It has grown from one sport to 24 over the last 130 years. Right now, the Mids have a clear advantage, and we're going to find out exactly how that happened. We'll also have our question of the day and see how our two athletes on the Midwatch are doing, so stay with us. We've got a lot to cover. Okay, welcome back to Navy Sports Central, everyone. Whether you are a returning listener or checking us out for the first time, thanks for making us part of your day. And let's go ahead and jump right into things. Before I get going, though, I just wanted to say that my trip to Annapolis a couple weekends ago was awesome, and I've got one or two stories to share with you about that as we get further into the show. But right now, let's go ahead and see what's happening with some of the Navy teams that have been in action lately. Today, we'll focus on the rifle, water polo, and women's rowing teams. And by the way, I will touch on the big wins the Mids had in men's and women's soccer and men's and women's cross country. We'll go ahead and hit those later on in the deep dive and midwatch segments. So here we go with the Navy rifle team. They came off a series of matches against ranked opponents over the course of the last two weekends. They took on number 11 Akron, number 12 Ohio State, number 16 Memphis, and number 4 Ole Miss. And during that stretch, they ended up with a 2-2 record, with the wins coming over Ohio State and Memphis. The Mids are led by senior captain Mike Zanti from Norfolk, Virginia. And I will tell you that he's really been in a zone lately because it seems like every time he goes out, he's setting either a new personal record or a new school record. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here. In the match against Ole Miss, which was their most recent one, they did come up short in that one, but the team tied their highest point total of the season. And one of the reasons for that was that Zanti scored 599 points out of 600 in the air rifle competition. So yeah, I'd call that some really good shooting. And just to give you an idea of what I mean, I'll reference something that Coach Mike Ante said in a conversation with Navy Sports' Phil Bergman a couple weeks ago. The competitors shoot at a target from a distance of 10 meters in the air rifle, and from there, that 10 ring looks like it's about as big as a period at the end of a sentence. So think about that for a second. From 10 meters away, that 10 ring literally looks like a dot, and Zanti nailed it on 59 out of 60 shots, which to me is just amazing. The guy keeps raising the bar every time he goes out, and he's leading a strong team as well. Freshman Mackenzie Shedd and senior Mark Omdahl have shot very consistently so far this year. Shedd finished third in both the small bore and air rifle against Ohio State and followed that up by placing second in both competitions in the win over Memphis. And Omdahl has shot a season best 595 in air rifle and 578 in small bore so far this year. Next up for the rifle team is Kentucky on October 30th, but the really big fall competition is the President's Trophy match where they'll be going against Air Force, Army, and Coast Guard the following week. So that should be a good one. Before we finish up with the rifle team, I did want to mention that I had an opportunity to interview Mike Zanti last year for the Navy Sports Nation blog. I believe it was back in November, and it was a pretty fun conversation. So I'll go ahead and put a link in the show notes so you guys can check it out if you want. Mike is also the son of Guy and Kathleen Zanti. Guy was in the class of 82, and he wrestled at Navy, and Kathleen is my classmate from 84, and she went by Kathleen Murray back then. And she's a part of that interview also. So if you want to kind of get a sense of what a parent goes through while supporting a son or daughter who participates in a sport that is certainly not traditional, check out the feature. Like I said, I'll go ahead and leave a link in the show notes, and you can see for yourself. All right, now let's move on to water polo. Last month, I actually featured the team in the Navy Sports Nation blog, and I'll leave a link for that one too, in case you want to take a look. Anyway, the team won a couple of games in a row after completing a West Coast swing that was really, really tough. They played against some of the best programs in the country. Right now, they are 8-10, but their conference record is 3-1. The Mids most recently beat Johns Hopkins and Bucknell. And over the next 4 weeks, they will finish up the remaining conference games before hosting the conference championships at Lejeune Hall. I think the team is set up to do pretty well the rest of the way. Coach Louis Nicolau really put them through the ringer a couple of weeks ago, and those games against teams like UCLA, which was ranked 3rd, and Santa Clara, which was ranked 9th, they were basically designed to raise the team's level of play. So we'll see how things go starting this week with Mount St. Mary's, but I've got a pretty good feeling about where the team is going to go from here. All right, now let's see what's going on with the women's rowing team. I will say that for all three programs, that being heavyweight, lightweight, and the women's team, the primary racing season is in the spring. Typically in the fall, they will train for longer distances than the standard 2,000 meters that they race in the spring. In fact, they can be 2 to 3 times longer. So it provides a great opportunity to lay a solid foundation as they get ready to defend their Patriot League championship. And by the way, I did get a chance to see the women practice a little bit when I was in Annapolis a couple weekends ago. I was there at the boathouse primarily to put together a feature for the lightweight rowing team, which I hope to publish in the blog towards the end of this month. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, the team's first race of the fall was the Navy Day Regatta, and it was held this past weekend in Philadelphia. The women entered a total of 9 boats in 3 different races. The number 1 varsity boat had a strong showing. They finished second behind Penn, and they covered that 4,000-meter course in 13 minutes, 48 seconds. The number 2 varsity boat, the varsity 8 boat, finished 5th. And in the varsity 4's race, the mids finished 2nd and 3rd in between a couple of boats from Penn. Now, the race that got my attention was the women's freshman 8 involving Navy, Penn, and LaSalle. And the mids absolutely blew the field away, winning by 50 seconds. So this outcome really speaks to the depth of the program. So let's think about that for a minute. These athletes have been rowing together for less than 2 months, and they've already made a statement against a pretty good Ivy League program where Penn is concerned. This is why the women's rowing team is so strong year in and year out. They start putting together winning crews from the day those athletes show up in Annapolis. And whatever that coaching staff is doing is working. I mean, all you got to do to confirm that is to look at their 6 consecutive Patriot League championships. And to be honest, I don't see anything standing in the way of them picking up another one. All right, that's going to do it for our sports update. Let's go ahead and take a quick break. And when we return, we'll really dive into this Army-Navy rivalry across all sports. I think you're really going to like what you hear, so stay with us. Okay, we are back and ready to get into our deep dive segment. Right now, the mids are into the second half of their fall sports season, and so far, Army and Navy have faced each other 7 times. The Black Knights came out on top in volleyball almost a month ago to take the initial lead in the Star Series, but since then, the mids have won every game to take a 6-1 lead. In just the last 2 weeks, Navy's defeated Army in men's and women's soccer and men's and women's cross country, and right before that, they posted wins in sprint football and men's golf. In all 4 of those matches, the mids were in total control pretty much the entire time. The win in men's soccer was especially great to watch because it was the team's first win since 2014. And if you happen to listen to our last podcast that previewed the game with my guest and classmate Chris McKenna, you'd have heard that his analysis on the team was right on the mark. And that brings me to this point. I'm not sure how many of you out there track the Army-Navy rivalry outside of football. I'm sure if you played a particular sport at the academy, or if you have a son or daughter who plays it, you probably do look at least one other one. But what about all the sports? Today, I'm actually going to try and break that down for you a little bit more. And by the way, in the interest of full disclosure, I did write an article in the Navy Sports Nation blog on this topic this past summer, but I thought discussing the Army-Navy rivalry across all sports would make good content for the podcast also. I'm thinking if nothing else, you can always send a link to your Army buddies if they ever start giving you any static just because they've won a few football games recently. Anyway, what I'll do is start with the first matchup, and then I'll hit some major milestones in the rivalry as we go through the chronological history. So we'll talk about when some of the other major sports were added and where the overall record stood at different points in time. And finally, I'll try to pinpoint the time when things really started to turn in Navy's favor, which has basically resulted in them dominating the rivalry across all 24 sports where they currently compete. As we get started, I did want to give a shout out to Justin Kashevsky, who is one of Navy's assistant athletic directors for sports information. I reached out to him in the summer when I was researching this feature for the blog, and I was just looking for information going back to maybe 1970, so just a little over 50 years. But Justin went way above and beyond the call and provided me with the results of every Army-Navy competition that's ever taken place, back from the very first one. So that was a huge bonus, and I just wanted to thank him for that. Okay, I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. The very first Army-Navy competition, as most of you probably know, was in football. The Mids won that game 24-0 on November 20th, 1890. And for the first 10 years, football was the only sport they played. Navy won 3 of the first 4 games. And I guess things got pretty intense after they won in 1893. Apparently, some Army general really got into it with a Navy admiral, and it nearly resulted in the two of them squaring off in a duel. So I guess they still actually had those things in the late 19th century. I wasn't sure about that. But anyway, I guess someone managed to calm them down, but the services were ticked off enough at each other that they didn't even play the game for the next 5 years. It started back up again in 1899, and Army did win that one. So the first decade of the rivalry ended with the Mids holding a 3-2 advantage. Then in 1901, Army and Navy started playing each other in baseball, but it was still only a 2-sport rivalry up until 1920. And that's when things really started to change. Between 1920 and 1940, 11 more sports were added, bringing the total to 13, and they included basketball, lacrosse, gymnastics, and outdoor track. Now, as far as the head-to-head competition goes, the Black Knights actually held a slight advantage up through 1935. If we're just looking at the number of years each side came out on top, Army won it 17 years compared to 13 for the Mids, and there were 9 ties. And that makes sense because there were only 2 sports played during those really early years. But it was roughly a period of about 4 decades, we'll call it 1935 to 1973, where the Black Knights really increased their advantage in the overall series. Now, the football teams were relatively even during the 40s and 50s. In fact, Navy barely came out on top there, going 10-8-2 during that 20-year stretch. But it was in the sports like rifle and pistol where Army was winning consistently. And the same was true in squash. But it was in gymnastics where Army really kind of dominated the Mids, because between 1949 and 1969, they only lost 1 time. So that was largely responsible for giving them the edge going up through 1973. And in fact, by that time, the Black Knights had a double-digit lead. They were ahead 37-26 with 12 ties. And I guess by that time, the Mids had decided they'd had just about enough. Now, if you had to identify the person who was most responsible for getting this turnaround started, I'd have to go with Bo Coppage, who became the athletic director at Navy in 1968. He was a 46 graduate of the academy, and he was actually an active duty captain at the time he took over the role, which was kind of unusual. And while he was at Navy, he played football and wrestled. On the football team, he was an offensive lineman. But anyway, this was a really, really good hire, because when you think about trying to get something like this turned around where you are at a disadvantage in the head-to-head competition, it makes total sense to hire somebody who knows what it's like to sing second. And I'd be willing to bet that Coppage knew the score coming in, and he had some plans to do something about it. He was the athletic director at Navy for 20 years, and during that time, the Army-Navy Sports Series expanded to 19 head-to-head competitions, and in the 1980s, 6 women's sports were added, starting with basketball in 1980, and the others that followed were swimming, cross-country, indoor and outdoor track, and also volleyball. We're going to get to the results that Coppage produced while he was the AD, and when we do, you'll see that he made beating Army a priority in all sports, not just football. And of course, all that starts with getting the right head coaches. So Coppage did 3 things that pretty much told everybody that he was ready to beat Army no matter what the sport was. First, he made sure that wrestling coach Ed Perry didn't go anywhere. Perry had been coaching the Mids since 1961, and he was already building a pretty strong legacy. When Coppage arrived, Perry was already in the middle of a 5-match winning streak versus Army. He was an outstanding coach who had won 3 NCAA titles when he wrestled in college. And it's not unreasonable to assume that with that kind of track record, other colleges were looking to scoop him up. But Perry ended up staying at Navy, and as it turns out, he never lost to the Black Knights while Coppage was the AD. In fact, his record was 22-2-3. And both of those losses and 2 of the 3 ties occurred during Perry's first 5 years as a head coach. And after that, his wrestlers just became absolute wrecking machines when it came to taking on Army. I mean, they would just crush them. It was routine for them to win by over 20 points. That was pretty much the expectation. In fact, in 1975, Navy beat the Black Knights by a score of 40-2. So when looking specifically at wrestling in the Army-Navy series, that was one where you could basically pencil the mids in for a win just about every year. They are currently dominating the head-to-head competition over Army with a record of 50, 10, and 5, and that includes a win last winter against the Black Knights up at West Point under new coach Kerry Kolot. So right now, the wrestling program is on pretty solid ground as it relates to the head-to-head competition against Army. And now we're going to talk about a hire that Bo Coppage made that helped get a program turned around in that Army-Navy series. As I'd mentioned earlier, Army usually got the best of the mids in gymnastics. I'd already spoken about that streak where they'd won 19 out of 20 years. And they also won 8 straight times in the 70s and the first part of the 1980s. So then in 1983, Coppage hired Pete Corman as the head gymnastics coach, and Corman was actually an Olympian. He competed in the 1976 Montreal Olympics, and I actually remember watching him. He won the bronze medal in the floor exercise, and he became the first American gymnast actually to medal in 44 years. Now, he only coached at Navy for 6 years, from 1983 to 88, but his record against Army was a perfect 6-0. And even more importantly, Corman raised the program to a level that it still maintains today. A win for the Black Knights in gymnastics is no longer a sure thing like it used to be, looking back at the 1950s through the 1970s. And in fact, the mids have enjoyed quite a bit of success against them the last several years. That includes 2 straight wins in 2019 and 2020, with the meet from last season being canceled due to the pandemic. Now, Navy Gymnastics is one of the more high-performing programs on the East Coast under Coach Kip Simons, and I think it all started when Coppage hired Pete Corman back in 1983. Okay, so far we've talked about one coach that Bo Coppage made sure did not leave Navy, and that being Ed Perry. And then with Pete Corman, he hired a coach to get essentially one of his programs completely turned around and more competitive with Army. And now I'm going to talk about Bo Coppage bringing on Paul Evans to lead the Navy basketball program. Evans came to the Naval Academy from St. Lawrence, which was a D3 school in upstate New York. And one of his strengths was developing power forwards and centers into high-quality players. And while he was at Navy, he produced 2 of the best in the history of the program, those being Vernon Butler and David Robinson. So Coach Evans spent 6 years at Navy before taking a job at Pitt after the 1986 season, and he never lost to Army either. His record was a perfect 7-0, and during those years, the mids were pretty tough to beat no matter who they played. In 1986, they just rolled through their regular season and their conference schedule, making it all the way to the Elite Eight in the NCAA tournament. And even though they lost to the eventual runner-up Duke, that Navy team continues to be recognized as the best one ever in Service Academy basketball. So just to recap Bo Coppage's track record, remember he came on board in 1968, and it was 1973 when things really started to kind of get turned around. From there until the end of Coppage's run as athletic director in 1988, the mids won the overall head-to-head competition against Army every single year. So that 37-26 lead that the Black Knights had to go along with the 12 ties, that was all gone by the time Coppage retired. Now the mids led in the series 41-37 with the 12 ties, and they were about to build on that in a pretty big way. So we're going to go ahead and take a quick break and talk about that when we get back. All right, thanks for staying with us here on Navy Sports Central. Carl Darden here with you, and we are continuing with our breakdown of the overall Army-Navy series by year. We left off at 1988 with Bo Coppage retiring, and that's when Jack Lengyel took over, and he served for 14 years. Jack is actually the father of one of my classmates, by the way. One of the more significant developments during Lengyel's tenure was the addition of women's soccer to the program, and it became part of the Army-Navy series in 1994. Now, what I liked about this was that from the very beginning, Lengyel was all in. I mean, he wasn't really interested in hiring some young coach to kind of cut their teeth as they got their coaching career going. He went right out and hired a soccer legend. Her name was Karen Gabera. She was an Olympic gold medalist and World Cup team member. And she still leads the program today. During the time that she's been on board, Navy has enjoyed an 18-12 record over Army in the head-to-head competition overall. And by the way, this year's team will be going for their third straight Patriot League title. And as I mentioned earlier, they did beat Army just this past weekend. That score was 3-1. And again, just a terrific game overall, a tremendous offensive performance. And the neat thing about Coach Cabrera, and this is true with several of the other programs, I've mentioned it before, the underclassmen just simply have no fear. I mean, the folks who scored in the game against Army this past weekend were two freshmen and a sophomore. Freshman Alexa Riddle put in the first goal, but the craziest one was the second one that freshman Amanda Graciano put in. It actually came off of a corner kick, and it was a high arcing try that caught a perfect gust of wind, and it looked like it was heading right towards the front of the goal, but the wind carried it right over the goalie's head and into the top right corner. So that was pretty amazing, and that gave the Mids a 2-0 lead. And by the way, they actually have a name for that kind of goal too. It's called an Olympico. That's the name given to a goal scored off of a corner kick unassisted. So pretty cool. I learn something new every day. And then finally, sophomore Katie Herman scored the last goal to give Navy a 3-0 advantage, and they held on to win 3-1. So congratulations to the women's soccer team and Coach Cabrera for coming up with another win in the Army-Navy Star Series. Okay, so after Jack Langlo retired in 2001, Chet Gladchuk became the athletic director at Navy. And the first thing he did was hire Paul Johnson to resurrect the Navy football program. He also convinced Cindy Timchall, who is a winner of multiple NCAA championships in women's lacrosse at Maryland, to come to Annapolis and start up the program at Navy. Coach Timchall is 6-0 versus Army, and she continues to build a strong championship culture. So I really do think that this team is one that can make a pretty deep run in the NCAA tournament in the next few years, and we'll just have to see how that goes. Remember, they had that great Final Four run back in 2017, and I just think they're really close to getting back there again. They got some really good talent this year. Now, one thing I've spoken about before relating to Chet Gladchuk is that he does have a knack for finding coaches that are really, really good fits for the Naval Academy. And just to name a couple, Jamie Cook with track and field, and also Carrie Colott, who I had mentioned earlier for Navy wrestling. They are terrific fits for their respective programs, and I think they'll continue to be successful in their head-to-head matchups against Army. Okay, so we've pretty much determined that it was 1968, which was the year Bo Coppage arrived at Navy as the athletic director, as being the tipping point for Navy athletics as it relates to the Army-Navy series. So let's go ahead and take a look at the records for each of these three athletic directors to see what I'm talking about. Under Bo Coppage, the Mids' overall record in the Army-Navy series was 18-1-1. And then Jack Langel took over, and during that stretch, they were 12-1. And then since Chet Gladchuk has been overseeing the program, they've gone 16-3-1. So that brings the overall record in terms of years to 69-41 in favor of Navy with 13 ties. So remember that in 1973, they were looking at an 11-year gap in terms of wins and losses. And since then, the Mids have gone a ridiculous 35-4, which includes a current 7-year winning streak. So I don't know about you guys, but that pretty much spells total domination to me across all sports. Now, the one thing I did want to cover was how the whole idea of the Star Series got started. And that occurred when both athletic programs began to expand, and as a result of being in the same league, the Patriot League, they began to meet more frequently in conference play across different sports. So what they decided to do was create a Star Series where in those sports where they might have the potential to meet more than once, they would designate one of those games as the star match. And each team would have the home field advantage on alternating years. So for example, this year, the women's soccer team, for example, played Army here at home, and that was a star match. And next year, it'll be up at West Point. So if they happen to meet later on in the Patriot League tournament, that would still count in the overall head-to-head competition, but not in the Star Series. Okay, so now to wrap up this discussion, I'm going to go over some pretty interesting numbers I found when I was doing the research for this piece. So there are going to be a lot of numbers coming at you, but I think they're important to know so you can really get a sense for how strong a grip the Mids have on this Army-Navy series. Okay, first of all, the overall record across all sports between Army and Navy, and you can see this on the Navy Sports website, it is currently 1,120 wins for the mids against 845 losses and 44 ties. And that's right up to the minute, okay? Just so you know, that does include the 6-1 record in the Star Series this year. Now, the overall record in terms of just annual competition, if we're just counting the number of years, that stands at 69 years for Navy, 41 for Army, and there have been 13 ties. In the Star Series record, if we're just looking specifically at games over the last 25 years, that's also in favor of the mids with 348 wins, 192 losses, and 11 ties. And if we're looking at the number of years that the Star Series has been won and lost in the last 25, that favors Navy also, 23 years against 1 for Army and 1 tie. Now let's look at the overall winning streak by year, and I'm not including ties in this one. Navy owns that one with an 18-year winning streak from 1973 to 1991. And if we focus specifically on the Star Series winning streak, the mids have that record too as well, with 14 straight years between 1997 and 2010. You may recall at the top of the program, I mentioned that Army and Navy go against each other in a total of 24 varsity sports. And historically, the mids lead in the overall competition in 20 of those 24 sports. And now let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of the teams that have had some really big success against the Black Knights head-to-head. And one of them we've already mentioned, that's a wrestling team. So this is the sport with the best winning percentage where the teams have met more than 10 times for the men. And as I mentioned before, the wrestling team has a record of 50, 10, and 5. And that's good for a winning percentage of a little over 76%. For the women, it's the swimming and diving team. They have a record of 36 and 4, which basically means they've beaten Army 90% of the time. And I'll close this out by leaving you with 3 more numbers. First, there are 12 teams that have a winning percentage of 60% or better against the Black Knights. And the 2 longest winning streaks. First, for the women, it is the swimming and diving team. That record right now stands at 32 and counting. They've won every matchup against Army since 1989. And for the men, it's also the swimming and diving team. That number stands at 30. They've beaten the Black Knights every year since 1991. So that is everything you'll ever want to know about the head-to-head competition between Army and Navy. And I think now you'll know, if you didn't know this before, you definitely know it now, that there is really no comparison in terms of the quality of these two programs. Now, I'm not knocking Army at all. I mean, they got some great athletes and they work hard over there. But when you look across the board, especially since 1973, Navy Athletics has made a commitment that they want to beat Army in every single sport, not just the big ones. So that is really cool to see. Okay, we are finished with our deep dive, but we just got a couple more things to cover. So hang in there for another few minutes, and we'll be right back with our question of the day and our mid-watch segments. Okay, we are in the home stretch, so let's go ahead and get into our question of the day. And for that, we need to go back 2 episodes for the last one, since our podcast on October 6th focused specifically on the men's soccer game against Army. So remember, we were talking about the mids' big win over the Black Knights in men's golf, and the question I asked was, what's the farthest distance you've ever holed out from during a round? And the choices were between 5 and 10 yards, 11 to 50 yards, 51 to 150 yards, and greater than 150 yards. And I did promise to share a couple of stories from the comments, so here's what I came up with. By the way, there were 2 choices that had 4 votes apiece, and that was in the 51 to 150 yard category and also greater than 150 yards. So for our first story, there was a hole-in-one mentioned, and that came from Bill Brown. He scored an ace in 2016 at the Hominy Golf Course in Colts Neck, New Jersey. And according to his comment, he did it with a 6-iron from about 180 yards out. So that's pretty good. And our second shot that was greater than 150 yards came from fellow classmate Brian Butler. He was playing the Torrey Pines South Golf Course in San Diego. He was on the 13th hole, which is a par 5, and he was about 200 yards out. So he took out his 3-wood, and hit a shot that was headed directly for the green. Now, it was getting kind of dark, so it was tough to make out the flight of the ball. In fact, Brian thought he had hit it over the green and into the bushes, but when they started looking around, they looked in the cup, and there the ball was. So that was pretty cool, especially to be able to do something like that at Torrey Pines, which is a pretty famous golf course. As you guys may know, it was the site of the U.S. Open this past summer. Now, it's been a long time since I've played golf, but when I first started out, I did get lucky and hole out from about 100 yards on a course I used to play when I lived in North Carolina. But unfortunately, it was only for birdie because I messed up my second shot, so kind of a wasted opportunity there. All right, thanks a lot for getting back to me on that question. So here's the one for this week, and it relates to the Army-Navy series. Of the 6 wins over Army so far in this year's Star Series, which one has been your favorite? And your choices, of course, are sprint football, men's golf, men's soccer, women's cross country, or men's cross country. So I'll go ahead and put that question up on the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page so you can answer it there. And I'm looking forward to hearing back from you. Okay, now let's finish things up with our mid-watch segment. Remember, we are following Avery Stoll from the volleyball team. I actually had a chance to watch her play against Holy Cross when I was in Annapolis over the long weekend. The Mids won that match pretty handily, 3-0. And Stoll had a really solid match. She ended up with 10 kills, which was second on the team, and she tied for first with 3 service aces. Anyway, I was right down there on the court for the first set, and let me say that you can really get a good appreciation for the power these athletes can generate. I was only about 10 feet away from where some of Avery Stoll's kills were hitting the floor, and the same goes for Jamie Llewellyn. And I'm here to tell you that those two, when they unload on a really nicely set ball, it just sounds different. I mean, they just absolutely crush it. So right now, the volleyball team is 4-5 in the Patriot League with 6 games to go, and that includes a rematch against Army on, I believe, November 5th. They do have some work to do if they want to improve their seeding for the tournament. Right now, they are in 6th place, and the team does have a shot at moving up a couple of spots to 4th if they can win at least 4 or 5 out of their remaining 6 games. Anyway, I did want to mention that Avery Stoll did have a terrific match against American University last week, but the Mids just couldn't make it stand up. They ended up losing that one 3-0, but all the sets were really, really tight, so it wasn't as bad as the score looked. In any case, the Mids did come back to beat Holy Cross for a second time just a couple of days ago. So on the year, Stoll now leads the team with 158 kills overall, and she averages about 2.5 per set. And she also has 20 service aces, including 3 in the Mids' last match against Holy Cross, and that's also good for 3rd place on the team. Defensively, she has 62 digs, which is second among Navy's hitters, and she's also 3rd on the team with 35 blocks. So I think the key for the Mids is just to eliminate the service errors and get the ball in play, because they have a pretty sound defense. So all it takes is to use that to get into a good rhythm offensively. And if they can do that, they can surprise a couple of teams in the Patriot League tournament. So that gets you caught up on Avery Stoll. Now let's just check in with Ashwin Briggs, who is the senior captain of the men's cross-country team. He played a key role in the Mids' convincing win over Army in their star match last weekend. Briggs placed 6th overall, and he was part of a pack that took 7 of the top 8 positions to just blow away the Black Knights by a score of 17-46. And remember that in cross-country, it's the low number that wins, just like in golf. And by the way, that win over Army did take place on the heels of the women's cross-country team defeating the Black Knights on the same course that very same day. So right now, Ashwin Briggs and the men's cross-country team are preparing for the Patriot League Championships. They will take place on October 30th, so good luck to Ashwin Briggs and the rest of the men's cross-country team as they go for another Patriot League title. Okay, that's going to do it for this edition of Navy Sports Central. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, if you like what you've heard, remember to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to spread the word to all the other Navy fans out there. We've been getting some great responses on our question of the day, and remember you can do that by going to the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. And just a quick reminder, the views expressed on Navy Sports Central are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Naval Academy or Navy Athletics. By the way, the music used on Navy Sports Central podcast comes to you from Audio Jungle. This is a great resource for purchasing the rights to use music from thousands of artists around the world, and those we feature in our podcast will be credited in our show notes. Talk to you soon, everybody. Until next time, this is Carl Darden. Go Navy, beat Army.